Somalia is one of the top 10 most underreported humanitarian stories of 2007, according to a list compiled by the international medical humanitarian group Doctors Without Borders, also known as Médecins Sans Frontières. The list highlights the plight of people in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zimbabwe, Sri Lanka, Chechnya, and other places. As we approach the end of the year, we take a look back at these forgotten crises. Nicholas de Torrente is the Executive Director of Doctors Without Borders USA, joining us in our Firehouse studio. Welcome, Nicholas. Good to have you here in the United States and in New York. Go through these crises. Tell us what you're paying attention to.
Well, Amy, as you put it, I mean, the purpose of the list really is to try to, highlight places where we feel that based on our experience as a medical humanitarian organization, and we're not everywhere, but this is the presence of our teams on the ground, where there's really such a mismatch between what we're seeing in terms of the magnitude, the severity of the problems, and then the level of media coverage. So it's a subjective list. It's not a perfect one in terms of the hierarchy of things. But for us, as you put it, Somalia is really very much on the top right now. I mean, our teams are struggling to get in. We have now teams in Mogadishu. We have international staff on the ground, and we're seeing a lot more now about what's going on, and we're having a better access to the population in terms of assistance. And the situation is very, very dire in terms of the violence against civilians. Heavy fighting in highly populated areas with, as we see it, quite a reckless disregard for civilians in Mogadishu. And hundreds of thousands of people have fled, and they're fleeing to the outskirts of the city, but also as far away as we have teams in Galkayo in the north, in Bosaso, which is close to the Red Sea, and all the way into Yemen. We had a team just pick up, try to provide assistance to survivors of who were fleeing into Yemen, and there were 50 people had died in this particular ship. 50 people were able to be rescued. So it's really quite dramatic. People are very desperate in terms of trying to flee what is happening in Somalia.
The Ethiopian troops that invaded are supported by the United States?
Well, yes, there's an international kind of community backing of the transitional federal government that came in on the coattails of the Ethiopian military invasion that took out the Islamic Courts Union who was present in Mogadishu at the time in southern Somalia. So there's an international community kind of backing for this transitional government, and that government is heavily supported by the Ethiopian troops there. But there's also resistance. I mean, the fighting is not one-sided. The insurgent groups are also committing, atrocities in terms of bombings and disregard for civilians as well. It's not a one-sided affair here.
But why the disparity in some of the coverage of these crises? For instance, there are periodic full-page ads in the New York Times, the Washington Post over the Darfur crisis, which is near to what's going on in Somalia, and yet there's so little coverage of the situation there.
Well, I mean, there are reasons in terms of also the difficulty of coverage for journalists. I mean, it's not easy to get to Mogadishu. It's not easy to get into Somalia. It's very hard for aid organizations. We're really struggling to work there because of the insecurity. It's the same for Zimbabwe, for instance, where there are restrictions, that are posed on journalists being able to cover the situation and for aid organizations to work. So I think that's part of the explanation. And then there's something very special that's happened around Darfur in this country, a kind of a coalition that came up and that mobilized a lot of attention, which is very unusual and very much the exception to the rule. I mean, if you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, I mean, in terms of the death toll, the impact, the long-standing nature of the conflict, and what's going on there, that also has remained quite forgotten compared to what's going on
there. What are the numbers? Why is it happening?
Well, there's, the thing is, the story of the Congo has been that there have been democratic elections. There's a new president that has been elected, and the story was a hopeful one that the country would now be, move on beyond the civil war. And there have been two very serious episodes of that. That's not what we're seeing happening in the eastern part, in particular. Where today we have the Congolese army backed by the UN forces trying to take out a rebel commander who is holding up in the North Kivu province. And this is a place that's very neighboring Rwanda, so there's a lot of 10 years of interaction with what happened in Rwanda in 1994, the genocide there, people fleeing into Congo, and this is kind of the ongoing continuation of that, and it's not resolved. And
the numbers, Dad?
The numbers, I mean, in this year we've had about 400,000 new displaced, and these are people who have been affected by war for many years and who are again forced to flee because of the fighting and because of the way the soldiers on all sides behave. In the Congo, soldiers are not paid. They pay themselves, so to speak, on the back of the civilian population. This means looting, rape, sexual violence is very, very high in the Congo. And, it's just, there's an unending cycle there where that is also fueled by the fact that there's a lot of natural resources, especially in that area, and people, the different groups are fighting over that. So there's political and economic reasons for this ongoing conflict there.
What about some of these other underreported crises, Chechnya and some of the others that get even less attention?
Yeah, well, Chechnya, the kind of intense fighting did drop off a few years ago. What we're concerned about is that, the consequences of the conflict still are very much present. I mean, there's still a high level of instability in that whole region, and the people who return to Chechnya from neighboring republics are very traumatized, extremely impoverished, and the healthcare system has really been destroyed. So, there needs to be much more of a focus there. Chechnya was always an embarrassing topic for the international community, backing Russia as a strategic partner, and this was always something that everyone preferred to ignore, what was going on in Chechnya. And now that the more, overt fighting has decreased, it's even easier now to just turn a blind eye to what's continuing to occur in Chechnya and the ongoing effects of the war and the deep-seated problems that have not been resolved yet.
Nicholas de Torrente of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, Burma.
Yes, well, Burma did get, of course, you've covered it and others have covered what happened, the pro-democracy protests against the military regime there. But this is really, in a way, the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's happening in Burma, in terms of the conditions of the population throughout the country. There are places, for instance, Rakhine State, which is in the western part of the country, where the Rohingya population there, these are Muslims, are not even considered to be citizens of Burma, and so they have no rights basically, and so the government disregards them completely. There's a lot of abuse, and the needs in terms of basic healthcare issues. HIV/AIDS is a major problem in Burma, and TB and other health issues are major problems, and so this is not being talked about. What's going on in the east with ongoing insurgencies, ethnically based insurgencies against the regime, again not being covered. That area is sealed off. The government does not want aid agencies to be present. So there are a lot of restrictions to the operations of aid organizations, and since there's a willingness to kind of cut off the regime and not to provide assistance that could support it, there's also a lack of engagement on the humanitarian side, and we think that these things can be a bit dissociated, and that there is a way to provide assistance quite more directly to the population in Burma, and not necessarily strengthen the hand of the military regime that doesn't care about the population anyway.
And in Sri Lanka, which has to be one of the longest running, least reported battles or ongoing battles in the world.
Well, in Sri Lanka, the problem is that the war flared up again, and there was a big attention to the tsunami, and there was a big aid response to the tsunami, and then attention waned, and the war restarted. It's interesting, actually, that there may be a connection, in fact, because the way the assistance was provided during the tsunami was a cause of grievance between the Tigers, the rebel movement in the north, and the government. Control over the aid flows and so on, which were so massive, was one of the issues that reignited the fighting for the past 2 years, and this leading to a lot of displacement in the east, and a lot of kind of the enclave in the north, where government services have been really curtailed, and we see it in terms of medical personnel. The hospitals have lost their medical staff, have lost their surgical staff, so we're able to go back in and provide services. But in a climate as well where there's a lot of suspicion of aid organizations, and that's also one of the consequences of the tsunami response, is that seeing this huge amount of aid, somewhat uncoordinated, somewhat unfocused, has raised a lot of suspicions on the part of the government in terms of what aid organizations are there to do, and that has made it more harder for us to provide assistance there. So it's a kind of an ironic twist when there was such mobilization to help Sri Lanka in the wake of the tsunami.
You're talking about some of the worst crises in the world, and according to Andrew Tyndall, publisher of the online media tracking journal, the Tyndall Report, the countries and contexts that you highlight at Médecins Sans Frontières account for just 18 minutes of coverage from January to November 2007 on the 3 major nightly newscasts.
Right. And I mean, it's one of the measures. I mean, people do get their news from a variety of different sources, and there are, there are other ways of getting information, and there's more hunger for that. And we see that in the proliferation of new media outlets, channels, people getting their information over the internet. I mean, you're, of course, extremely aware of this. But still, the nightly news is a good measure of how the mainstream media tries, the attention it focuses on these issues. And it's a bit shocking, of course, to see that, major problems just don't get any attention at all, they don't even deserve, and that's the problem. I mean, we don't think that media coverage is the panacea, that if you get media coverage, you'll automatically get a solution. Of course not, but if it's not even reported, it's not even on the radar screen, it's not even on the map, then that's a real issue.